I haven't seen such a good-looking bunch of people since the last time I was in Alberta. I was originally planning to speak to you about responsibility. I wanted to suggest that you should be leery of trusting people whose primary concern appears to be their own rights, or the rights of the hypothetically oppressed groups that they hypothetically, but by no means necessarily, speak for. I still want to do that. It's better for young people to concentrate on their responsibility rather than their rights. They've been cared for all their lives by other people, being as of yet unable to give back to the world what it takes to ensure their survival. It's not merely an issue of obligation either. Young people, not only young people, need meaning in their lives, as well as due regard from others. And meaning is to be found in responsibility. People find meaning in the responsibility of their careers, their families, their friends, the charitable work they do for others, the education they pursue, the voluntary obligations they undertake, and the suffering they endeavor to reduce. It's not the rights that are granted to you by others so that you can be awarded your rewards and privileges that will make your limited and mortal life worthwhile. It is instead the sacrifices you make to the highest good that you can conceptualize and strive to attain. Beware the peddlers of rights. They wish to turn you into someone who is simultaneously privileged and victimized, whiny, narcissistic, noisy, demanding, chronically unhappy, and of little use to themselves or other people. Instead, sort yourselves out, shoulder your responsibilities, make yourself useful to others, find the heaviest burden you can bear, and bear it stoically, forthrightly, and admirably. Having dealt with that, I'll turn to something that I believe is more pressing. You're all here because you're concerned about the future. I'm concerned about the future too. Because of that concern, I feel it necessary to say a few words, which I'm still trying to formulate properly, about the newest form of political pathology to manifest itself in this, our desperately confused and chaotic Western society. Truly, however, I should not say newest. I should say instead the resurgence of an exceptionally dangerous, logically incoherent, and thoroughly discredited old idea. One that doomed entire societies and huge populations to unnecessary suffering in the bloody and unfortunate and all too forgotten 20th century. The idea? Equality. A reasonable value when placed among other values, but a deadly God when elevated to the highest place and promoted blindly and with an undertone of undeserved martyrdom, resentment, jealousy, spite, and hate. It's not just equality in its more banal manifestations, not merely equality of opportunities, say, that I want to talk about, but equity, equality of outcome, the ultimate rabid wolf in the most caring of sheep's clothing. The flag of equity is being raised everywhere, and it's the very social justice warriors, the very postmodern neo-Marxist activists whose words I despise, who are waving it everywhere. The danger this presents can barely be overstated. It needs to be stopped. When I spoke at McMaster University last year, the profane chanters, students under the spell of their reprehensible professor's ideological idiocy, insisted repetitively, "This is where we draw the line. This is where we draw the line. This is where we draw the line," referring to my hypothetical bigotry and uncaring attitude towards the individuals they purported to represent. Today, I want to draw a line of my own, and I encourage you to join me in doing so. We have to bring the confused, historically ignorant, and resentful purveyors of the terrible doctrine of equality of outcome to a halt. We have to draw a line before the functional structures that make up our society are undermined and damaged beyond repair. So I'm going to talk to you today about the great errors the self-righteously caring attitude of the equity purveyors hide within the confines of their low-resolution, incautious, algorithmic ideological propaganda. I cannot present a complete argument, but I can at least outline the territory that must be mapped in more detail and publicized broadly. For decades, hypothetically well-meaning people on the left have been beating the drum for a society where equality of opportunity is the norm. By and by large, this is also a goal supported by people in the political center and on the right. Society is better served and individuals better provided with the means of moving forward forthrightly and with hope when arbitrary impediments to the realization of their abilities are eliminated, to the degree that is possible. However, even the elimination of inequities related to opportunity is something that must be attempted with all due care. The ability to raise children thoughtfully and carefully, and to provide them with high-quality education, social networks, and the opportunity to develop their own skills and interests is not something equally distributed among all parents. This means that some children will be provided with opportunities that others will lack. Governmental or other organizations may attempt to provide redress for such inequality, but that's done at some risk. A substantial proportion of what is done positively for children and good families occurs at such a young age that government intervention, however well-meaning, would mean invasion, occupation, and colonization of the family, to a degree likely to produce negative consequences that far outweigh whatever positive good might be done. A good rule of thumb might be that our society should strive to do whatever good can be done for disadvantaged children and their parents, but does not simultaneously interfere with or make more difficult the good that is already being done by parents who are skilled and fortunate enough to do their demanding job in an admirable and socially productive manner. Substantive debate between those on the left interested in broad-scale social interventions to improve life quality for those who are less fortunate, and those on the right who wish to protect and maintain the integrity and the rights of the family must continue untrammeled so that the dangers that lurk on the unmoderated extremes can be minimized. We don't want to let any children suffer unnecessarily. We don't want the abilities and skills they might develop and offer to society to be wasted. But we don't want impersonal, large-scale systems suffering from the pathologies of gigantism to interfere with the function of the basic family unit, which, despite its inadequacies, has yet to be replaced even conceptually by anything remotely as functional. The provision of universal secondary and, to a degree, post-secondary education has leveled the playing field substantially. The safety net provided by universal health care plays the same role, as does the offering of old age pensions, disability allowances, unemployment insurance, and welfare. Although individuals across the political spectrum continue to debate the details of size and implementation associated with such methods of income redistribution, there is substantial agreement among all regarding their essential utility. It might be also noted that there are conservative as well as liberal and left-wing arguments to be made in favor of some flattening of income inequality. The data indicating that serious crime, including, most importantly, male-on-male homicide, may be driven to levels that threaten social stability when inequality increases beyond some hypothetical optimum, are solid and persuasive. Thus, there is a case to be made for enhanced social stability through the intelligent distribution of at least opportunity and perhaps of income itself, as well as the case that is made by more left-leaning individuals on behalf of abstract fairness. Nonetheless, there are already questionable practices associated with improvement of the quality of opportunity, of equality of opportunity, that have been set in place in addition to those already noted. These include, most particularly, the so-called affirmative action programs that have become almost universally instantiated in the hiring, placement, and promotion processes that characterize most large modern institutions. In place, theoretically, to provide redress for historical inequalities, such as the history of slavery that characterized the American black population some 6 generations ago. Perhaps a case can be made for such things as well, although they are associated with clear dangers. The most egregious of these is the insistence, tied integrally to the claims of those enamored with postmodern identity politics, that certain group-oriented aspects of human identity, such as race, sex, and now sexual proclivity and gender identity are sufficiently real and important so the judgment of people on the grounds of individual competence alone should be suspended in favor of ill-defined claims of social justice. On the minor end, these include statements in job postings indicating that applications from individuals with certain specified group-level attributes are particularly welcome. What dangers are associated with such practices? Well, the first is that specifying particular welcome on the part of some groups clearly implies less welcome on the part of others, as the postmodern theorists who push such things forward would be first to point out. Such thinkers constantly make the claim that value structures by necessity exclude and should be flattened for that reason. They don't extend the same rationale to attempts to hire preferentially, however, because the Marxism that lurks behind their hypothetically pure postmodern reasoning justifies identification of people by group identity and selection on that basis, because of its insistence that the dialectic of oppressor and oppressed characterizes all so-called power structures. The second problem is that only a very narrow subset of the wide range of potential group identities, and therefore group inequalities, can possibly be identified and rectified by such practices. Privileging those elements of group identity above all others, again, using the appalling terminology of the postmodernists themselves, means instantiating those and only those elements as vitally characteristic of the individuals in question. To encourage or select on the basis of race and sex and the other sacred descriptors of the modern anti-individual left is simultaneously to insist that those are the categories upon which people should be judged. It doesn't take much in the way of intelligence and insight to see how easily this process can be reversed and used in the opposite direction by those on the radical right, who might be inclined to insist that race and sex are precisely the relevant categories by which people should be judged, for the very purposes of exclusion and prejudicial discrimination that those on the left hypothetically oppose. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. Such a reversal is making itself currently manifest in the increasing proclivity of those attacked, for example, for their, quote, white privilege, end quote, to start insisting on their racial identity as a primary hallmark and to shift from guilt to overt claims of supremacy. What else would you possibly expect? Something very similar happened with the Black Power and Black is Beautiful movements in the late 60s and early 70s. The third problem is the tendency for demands for equality of opportunity to devolve ever more rapidly and seriously into demands for equity, which has now become defined as equality not of opportunity, but of outcome itself. This is happening currently at a rate that beggars belief, given the absolute catastrophes that social, economic, and political policies predicated on equality of outcome have produced in the past. What does equity mean? It's predicated on two ideas, each more pernicious than the other. The first is that all social institutions must produce outcomes of whatever sort that are precisely equal across all possible group identities. The second is that social institutions that do not produce those equal outcomes do not produce them because of institutional racism, sexism, or otherism that is as well characteristic of the explicit and implicit prejudices of those individuals who make up the institutions in question. There are a number of logical reasons why such demands cannot be met and are not desirable, even in principle. Surrounding those logical reasons is a plethora of historical data indicating, most recently in Venezuela, that economic policies predicated on the idea of radical equality are catastrophic, even genocidal. We'll start with the logical reasons. To determine whether or not a given institution is inequitable, the institution is first stratified according to the hypothetical privilege and power it awards to different individuals who occupy different positions within it. Then, the demographic makeup of those strata are analyzed along lines of racial, ethnic, sexual, and gender identity, as well as sexual proclivity, and contrasted with the demographics that obtain in the general population surrounding the institution. What is wrong with this? First, such analyses are predicated on the idea that institutions primarily function to distribute resources and reward. That's only one of their many functions. It's a hallmark of the kind of ideologically rigid conceptualization that drives such assessments that only one factor is ever considered. This makes being right and being self-righteous about it a very straightforward matter, radically and absurdly reducing the cognitive demands that a truly comprehensive analysis would require. Complex, hierarchical social organizations are not simply mechanisms for distributing resources and rewards, nor are they, in case it needs to be said, merely structures of power, privilege, and oppression. They are in part, of course, both of these. In tyrannical societies, they may mostly be both of these. But in functional and free societies, such as those that primarily characterize the West, despite its flaws, they are also structures of responsibility and production. The evidence for this is overwhelming. By historical and current world standards, people in the West are well-housed and well-fed. In fact, we're more currently threatened by obesity than by starvation. With few exceptions, everyone has indoor plumbing, central heating, access to education, and connections to the World Wide Web, which provides on an entirely reliable basis more information at lower cost than has ever been available previously. The fact that the West does this with great efficiency, comparatively speaking, can be seen in the fact that immigrants move virtually without exception from the great bulk of dysfunctional, tyrannical societies from all over the world to the comparatively free and productive countries of Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, and not the reverse. Our complex social tools of production make and do things, and, more importantly, make and do things that people want, regardless of what might be regarded as their consumerist triviality. No centrally planned economy produces a selection of shampoos or toothbrushes or automatic watch winders or kite surfing kites or lightweight bicycles or video games. A haughty-minded and judgmental social justice advocate might dismiss such hyper-production as trivial, but is still very likely to spend hours per day texting his or her friends desirable political cliches on expensive iPhones and Androids. One man's meat is another man's poison, and it is by no means clear who should judge whether something that someone else desires may be acceptably produced in a world where absolute privation still exists. Because our hierarchical organizations make and do things that people want, and because people differ in their competence in doing so, different people experience different demand for their services. We adjudicate such demand with pay. This is the alternative to slavery. If you are producing things that people want, then you are entitled to charge what people are willing to pay for your services, or to refuse to provide such services at your whim if you choose. You get this privilege because what you provide for other people has value, and it is therefore useful for other people to encourage you to continue to provide it. They don't have to buy what you're offering either, any more than you have to produce it. Although that's not the very definition of freedom, it certainly constitutes an important element of freedom. Because some people are more competent at making or doing those things, they can demand a higher price for their participation. This is because of what they're offering, not because of what they intrinsically deserve. It may be the case that unearned elements of identity determine to some degree the differential probability that any given individual will come to occupy a place where he or she can offer the fruits of their labor. But it is also the case that their skill at production is a major contributor. This has been demonstrated empirically. Complex jobs, administrative, managerial, and academic, require high intelligence and high levels of the big five personality trait conscientiousness. The most careful of psychometric investigations into such things have clearly demonstrated that a combination of intelligence and conscientiousness, which can both be accurately measured, correlates at about 0.6 with long-term life success in such occupations. Some of the remaining variation in success can be attributed to random factors, such as health, and even counterproductively unfair systemic prejudice, along with a fair degree of measurement error, as productivity and success are notoriously hard to quantify. Nonetheless, correlations of that magnitude are exceptionally rare in the social and health sciences, and they are not to be easily and carelessly dismissed. The same thing can be said with regards to success in entrepreneurial and creative endeavors, which, when complex, also require intelligence, but demand big five trait openness, which is a dimension indexing capacity to produce novel ideas and perceptual frames. To the degree that traits obviously and logically linked to productive success actually predict such success, the systems in which such success manifests itself can be regarded as examples of fair and reasonable games. It should also be pointed out that many such games exist so that people who are not conscientious or intelligent or creative still have a chance to win. In popularity, say, in desire for leisure time, in the formulation of close interpersonal relationships, or in the provision of safety and security. These other domains of potential achievement are differentially valued by people in accordance with their intrinsic traits of personality. This means that a person who is primarily agreeable, for example, may well choose to maximize their engagement in interpersonal relationships at the cost of career or entrepreneurial success. And who is to say that's not a reasonable trade-off? It is also the case that there are many more elements of group identity that must be reasonably considered if the case can be made that the elements of race and sex, etc., must be considered. People are differentially successful because they're older. Older people are wealthier. Well, why? Well, because they've had their whole life to generate wealth. Is that fair or unfair? Should it be rectified? Or is it reasonable? They're younger. They're better at sports if you're younger. You're more likely to attract sexual partners if you're younger. Some things are better for men. Some things are better for women. Some things are better for attractive people. Some things are better for people who are of the majority race or religion or tribe or language. Some things are more accessible to unattractive people. So character acting, for example, falls into that category. People have different interests. People have different education. People have different levels of mental and physical health. And people differentially regulate their use of drugs and alcohol. Those are all dimensions upon which people can be categorized by group. And there's no reason to privilege race, sex, sexual identity, gender expression, and above these other dimensions of group identity, which are equally valid and play an equally important role. People judge different outcomes as of different worth. Love, children, leisure, power, duty, service, pleasure, aesthetics, novelty, spirituality. All of these factors and many more combine to determine inequitable outcomes. How then should people be properly categorized to ensure equity? Even a small set of entities can be categorized in a near infinite number of ways. Who's going to measure all these differences? Who's going to determine which of them are important and which of them aren't? Who's going to measure the outcomes and sum them up? To complicate issues further, who is going to determine whether they are biologically instantiated, socially constructed, or mere choice, apparently like gender? Are they mutable or fixed and deterministic? If they're mutable, merely as a matter of choice, as legislation in Canada now insists, for example, with regards to gender identity and gender expression, that should those differences also be regarded as relevant determinants of inequity? If people can change their group categorization merely as a consequence of an act of will, why would you consider that a relevant category to determine levels of inequality? Furthermore, who's going to measure and determine the rewards? Are we going to insist that everyone must be equally popular and outgoing, equally assertive and enthusiastic, equally private and introverted, caring, polite, or demanding and competitive, industrious and orderly, creative and interested in ideas? Why are those outcomes less important or less worthy of note than corporate position or economic compensation? Or are we going to swallow without question the idea that career, position, and monetary gain are the only genuine values that exist, that should be considered, and that are worthy of merit? It's a very strange thing for those on the radical left to insist that the very criteria by which large corporations judge the utility of individuals are precisely those that should be used to assess equality of outcome, fairness, and diversity. Let's say it again. It isn't what you deserve for intrinsic reasons that determines your outcome. It's the worth that others attribute to your offerings. Think of an offering on eBay. No seller says, I am Azerbaijan and my mother has Alzheimer's and I'm not well educated, but I'm tall and strong, although not very attractive, and I was bullied as a child, but I'm quite musical, although I only have one friend, and I'm slightly overweight and prone to anxiety, so you have to pay me $50 for my second-hand crock pot. They say, instead, I have this item, and you don't care who I am, and I don't care who you are, except that I will describe it honestly and ship it, and you will pay for it if we can agree on a mutually beneficial price. That's trade. The reward runs both ways. Trade is not charity. Trade is mutually beneficial. Trade does not and cannot rectify historical or biological injustices. It can only partly and momentarily satisfy the people engaged in the particular trade. Attempts to redistribute through trade tend to kick back. Look at Venezuela. People there have now lost an average of 18 pounds. Cuba can barely feed itself. Everything is run down and barely functional. I think one of the most comical things I've seen in recent years was the motor convoy transferring Fidel Castro's damned corpse to the cemetery, breaking down in the middle of the procession. Everything is run down and barely functional. Why? Because the problem of distribution is so complex that it has to be outsourced to the collective intelligence. No person, group of persons, or imaginable computational device can perform the calculations of price. The measurements can't even be made. This is because the price of anything is dependent on the price of everything else. And to make it worse, is always shifting. Flawed as the free market system is, we don't have anything better. But let's say instead we transfer determination of power, status, privilege, and desire to a group of people. What group? How do we regulate their biases and correct for their ignorance? How do we limit their power? How do we protect ourselves against their ideologies and hatred and resentments? How do we discriminate the desire to help the unfortunate from the wish to destroy the well-constituted and successful? We don't, and we can't, and we won't. What will happen is that those best at political maneuvering, most convinced of their righteousness, least aware of their ignorance and limitations of knowledge, and soon most filled with resentment and hatred, will instantly rise to dominate such positions, and then all hell will break out. How do we know this? Because it already happened. And it killed 100 million people and made untold others destitute and miserable. And it just about destroyed the world. We already ran this experiment, and it failed. And then we ran it again, and it failed. And then we ran it again, and then it failed. And then we replicated the failure. No one who was not ignorant would dare to experiment with such things again unless they were truly malevolent. So, which is it, you purveyors of equity, you merchants of yesterday's poison? Are you ignorant or malevolent?
La revolución necesita de tu ayuda. Deposita, suscríbete, comparte los videos, apórtanos en el Patreon para que podamos seguir luchando por la libertad.